The short story novelist Flannery O'Connor famously said once that truth does not change based on my ability to stomach it. Truth is truth whether we like it or not. That can easily be understood in terms of scientific truth. For example, whenever we see the facts and the scientific research to prove whatever the scientific truth might be, we don't necessarily have to like it, but it's true. It's also easy to kind of accept in terms of mathematical truths. Whether or not you enjoy algebra class or trigonometry, at the end of the day, it's still true. You don't have to like it. It's a little bit more difficult for us to accept whenever we talk about theological truths, and especially moral truths. We would prefer to give more weight sometimes to our preferences and our emotions rather than what is objectively true. Especially at this time in history, we tend to focus a lot on our emotions. And you see, our emotions are important. God gave us our emotions, and they are a gift to us. Our emotions are relevant information, and they are real experiences that we experience. So it's not that we ignore our emotions or say that they're purely wrong, but our emotions are just part of the story. It's just part of what makes us human. We are also reasonable, intellectual. We have rationality, and there is an order to the universe. There is an objective reality that is greater than ourselves and outside of ourselves. So our emotions is just one part of the conversation. But truth does not change based on our ability to stomach it. In today's gospel, we are on week 4 of the survey of John chapter 6, continuing our discussions and themes on the Eucharist. At this point in John's gospel, at this point in chapter 6, we have seen a lot. We've already seen the multiplications of the loaves and the fish. We've heard about Jesus talk about himself as the bread of life, and so on and so forth. And initially, when Jesus talks about being the bread of life, bread is easily accepted to be a symbol of nourishment in God's providence. So no harm, no foul. They're tracking along. But eventually, Jesus becomes more and more clear, more and more specific about what he really means by that. And it becomes a little bit more unsettling, a little bit more uncomfortable for them to receive this teaching. Because Jesus says, "This is my body." He says, the bread that I will give is my flesh. And what we see now in today's gospel is that the Jews are quarreling. They are arguing amongst themselves. They're not excited about what's been said, and they're trying to figure out how to respond. And Jesus is very aware of their emotional reaction. He's aware that they are having a tough time accepting the fact that he just said out loud that the food that he will give is his flesh. So what does Jesus do in the face of their emotional response? He clarifies. He doesn't shy away from the truth in order to cater to their emotional difficulties. He simply clarifies. And in his clarification, he doesn't become arrogant and overly dominant to condescend them and patronize them. He simply clarifies, gently but clearly. He says, "Unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you do not have life within you." And further clarification, in Greek here, he changes the verb. Initially, the verb is phago, which is to eat. That's what he was using previously in John chapter 6. But now the verb is trogo, meaning to gnaw, to chew. In other words, to get even more specific, that yes, he means to actually eat the flesh of the Son of Man. And then he says to drink his blood. This is totally a new idea for them. Blood, up until this point in Jewish theology, is understood to be a sign of life, and therefore reserved for the priest to pour onto the altar and to give it back up to God. But the Jews don't touch the blood, or that considers them unclean. They certainly don't eat any blood of any animals, especially not the blood of the Son of Man. This is totally radical for them to receive. But Jesus says it very clearly, very directly. He says, "He who eats my flesh and drinks my blood remains in me. My flesh is true food, my blood is true drink." Jesus could not be any more clear. But notice his style, notice his rhetoric here. He's not being mean and harsh, but he's not shying away from the truth out of fear for their emotional reactions. He's given it to them, plain and simple. Whenever we think about our faith, there's a lot of hard truths. It's not easy to be Christian, much less Catholic. There's a lot of hard truths that we teach. The Eucharist being a really hard truth. A lot of people struggle with that one. Other hard truths may include Mary, purgatory, papal authority, praying to the saints. Those are some common ones. But I'd be willing to bet that the hardest truth that many of you may struggle with is truths that have to do with marriage, family, and the body. What you are allowed to do and not do with your body. I have to admit, as a priest who is a priest 6 years, going on my 7th, I oftentimes get the question, like, what's your favorite part of priesthood, least favorite part? People want to know, what's the least favorite part, or rather, what's the hardest part, they often ask. And, I've been asked that question enough times now that I think I have my answer. I think the hardest part of priesthood, at least for me, just my opinion, is to talk with people about marriage, family, and the body. Especially when those people don't like the church's teaching. Actually worse, when those people know the church's teaching but find themselves on the other side of it. That's hard. I'm speaking in euphemisms here to be family friendly, but I think you know kind of what I mean. There's a lot of different church teachings in this area that are just really hard to accept. And a lot of people struggle. And it is tough, especially when someone finds themselves in an irregular situation. And oftentimes these people didn't realize it when they got in this situation. And, they didn't fully know maybe whenever they started in this situation, but now they realize it. Now they don't know what to do. They feel stuck. Or sometimes they're not personally dealing with it, but someone in their family is dealing with something along the lines of marriage, family, or the body. And they're just trying to figure out how to deal with this, how to talk about it, how to have a relationship with this person, and what can we do, what can we not do? What can we say, what can we not say? This is hard. And it's really hard whenever the people in these situations have high emotions. Oftentimes because they've suffered a lot. And a lot of times in these conversations, because of the high emotions, the church becomes the enemy. And they become the victim. And that is hard to deal with as a priest. These people aren't bad. You're not bad. These people oftentimes are well-intentioned, and they're just desiring to not be stuck anymore. But it's hard to figure out sometimes, isn't it? And lots of us would just prefer to just shy away from these conversations and just not deal with it. But unfortunately, we find ourselves in these situations where it just keeps coming up in so many different people's lives, and we have to face it eventually. So what I can say is that I've made a lot of mistakes along the way in these conversations, and I don't particularly have the golden recipe for you, but what I do know is two guideposts in particular. We have to keep in mind truth and charity. Pope Benedict XVI talks about this in his encyclical Caritas in Veritate, which is Latin for charity and truth. And he talks about how important it is to keep both together. They're really two sides of the same coin, especially whenever we're talking about hard moral teachings of the church. We really need to bring truth and charity together. Because he says that charity without truth leads to an over-sentimentalization. And just people tend to give too much weight to their emotions, which oftentimes can be very harmful to them, not just spiritually, but sometimes psychologically and even physically as well. It's funny, take the moral part out of it and just apply it to, for example, human safety. It makes sense for us that emotions are not just enough to protect us. So, on just the purely human safety level, if a toddler wants to go swimming in the deep end and he doesn't know how to swim, and he's crying and throwing a fit, the mom's not going to let him do that without floaties. Or at least, good parents wouldn't. So it makes sense for us. That's a no-brainer because it involves safety, right? But translate it to moral truths, and suddenly, don't tell me what to do. And they, now it's adults crying. And we say, okay, well, fine. Since you're crying, do what you want, you do you, and I'm not going to judge. And of course, we're not going to judge, but at the same time, it's like this weird, awkward situation because we sometimes fall into this charity without truth. We want to care so much about the person that we will abandon the true teachings of the gospel and of the church because we're afraid of the emotional response that we might receive. But on the flip side, some people are more inclined, just because of their temperament and their personality, to go the other extreme of emphasizing the truth of the church without the charity. They're very zealous for justice. They love to put things in order and to call people to task. And sometimes those people actually do just as much harm, but in the other direction. A truth without charity can be oppressive. It can be harmful. It can be hurtful and push people further and further away from Jesus and his bride, the church. Regardless of your personality and your preferences, each one of you is going to probably tend towards one or the other. Some of you, just because of who you are, you're going to tend more towards the charity without the truth. And others of you are going to tend more towards the truth without the charity. But it doesn't really matter about your personality and your preferences. All of us have to figure out how to bring the two together. And that's where it gets hard. And it's especially hard in that one-on-one conversation with someone that you love. Most of us would rather just avoid the conflict. But Jesus is a beautiful model for us in today's gospel. He's able to talk about a hard teaching in a way that incorporates both truth and charity. And we need to figure out how to follow his example. The reality is we're just going to have more and more of these conversations because more and more of these moral issues are just going to come into our life and in our families' lives, and we're going to be struck with all kinds of moral dilemmas, and sometimes it's just not an easy answer. Or sometimes it is pretty simple, but the emotions aren't. And we need to reverence both truth and charity. It's not easy, but we can do it. And today we pray for the moral courage to respond like Christ in these difficult moral topics with truth and with charity. Amen.